And engineer sergeant stood in the waist-deep water of the Via River, his hands slick with silt and grease as he lashed bridge pontoons together. Around him, German mortar fire and 88mm shells turned the river into a series of violent geysers. The year was 1944. The sergeant stayed in the current, securing the steel treadways until the first tank of the 3rd Armored Division hit the metal plates. But then, the lead Sherman stalled. Its engine died right at the water's edge, blocking a column that stretched miles back into the dark lanes of the Cotentin. It was a moment of total friction that raised a question that would define the entire summer. How did the Americans turn a graveyard of fields into a breakout? To understand why the Via was such a lethal bottleneck, we must look back to the moment the invasion momentum died in the mud of the Norman hedges. The original Allied strategy was built on the assumption of speed. The British were supposed to capture the city of Caen on the first day to provide a gateway to the flat plains leading to Paris. They did not. Caen remained a strategic bottleneck, and when it failed to fall, the entire Allied timeline collapsed. This failure forced a strategic imbalance that shifted the weight of the campaign. General Omar Bradley and his First Army were shoved into the Cotentin Peninsula. This landscape looked like a pastoral patchwork on a map, but it functioned as a natural fortress for the German defenders. By the end of June, the Allies had funneled 1 million men and 500,000 tons of supplies onto the shores of France. Yet because the advance had stalled, all of that combat power was squeezed into a tiny fraction of the intended area. The Americans had the men and the machines, but they had nowhere to put them. The landscape here was the Bocage. These were ancient dirt walls, some 4 feet thick and 12 feet high, topped with tangled trees that blocked out the daylight. Every field was a self-contained killing zone where the air hung heavy with the sound of muffled artillery. Bradley's 70-mile front was a claustrophobic world of sunken lanes that felt like damp caves. At Carrington, German shellfire fell constantly on the single bridge that provided the only supply route for the sector. Logistics were further crippled by a severe channel storm between June 19th and 21st. The storm destroyed one of the artificial harbors and forced the Americans to rely on beach improvisation. Airstrips were placed so close to the water that flight operations constantly disrupted ground traffic. This environment neutralized American advantages in armor and air power. The tanks could not see through the hedges, and the planes could not tell friend from foe in the dense green maze. A jarring disconnect persisted between the high command and the men in the foxholes. In the rear areas, there was a stability of organized supply depots and bureaucratic business as usual. But at the front, it was a different world. The infantry lacked the training or equipment to navigate a landscape that defied all pre-invasion planning. The grinding warfare at places like Hill 192 forced a reliance on short-range air support and heavy combat that stalled the expected. Bradley realized his army was being bled white in a war measured in yards. Bradley was left to figure out how to punch through a terrain that seemed designed for ambush. The German command structure was dysfunctional and plagued by direct meddling from Berlin, but their soldiers knew how to use the dirt. They turned ancient property lines into lethal fortifications. The Americans were left to endure the back-breaking labor of moving supplies through narrow paths while suffering from the weight of the Hedgerow stair. The transition to a high-mobility pursuit would not happen because of a single brilliant maneuver. It would happen because the Allied command finally realized they had to stop fighting the terrain and start destroying it. The Americans had reached the limit of their doctrine. To understand why the advance died in the first weeks of July, you have to look at what the infantry saw when they stepped off the beaches. They had been trained on the open, rolling hills of the American Midwest. Doctrine told them to use fire and maneuver, to call in artillery on a visible enemy, and to let tanks lead the way. But the peninsula was a different world entirely. It was a landscape of 10,000 tiny fields, each one functioning as an individual fortress. These earthen walls were composed of dirt and stone, held together by tree roots that had grown for centuries. The roots were so dense they could stop a 30-ton tank. In a normal battle, a squad leader can see his flanks and the location of the next platoon. In the hedges, every man was isolated. Every time a squad moved through a gap in a bank, they were walking into a pre-registered kill zone. German machine gunners just had to point their weapons at the only 3 openings in a field and wait. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedge, its soft underbelly was exposed to anti-tank fire while its own guns pointed at the sky. It was a geography that turned every 100 yards into a separate, bloody campaign. On July 3rd, the 82nd Airborne was ordered to take the Pottery Ridge. The initial plan was a standard frontal assault into the teeth of the German defense. It was a disaster. The men were being slaughtered in the sunken lanes before they even reached the base of the ridge. General Ridgway stood in the mud and realized that traditional doctrine was a death sentence. He sketched a wheeling arrow in the dirt with his boot to show his colonels how to stop dying in frontal charges. It was the first sign of tactical adaptation. General Ridgway realized that if they kept following the manual, there would be nothing left of the 82nd Airborne by sunset. He leaned over a patch of mud near his command posts and sketched a wheeling arrow in the dirt with the toe of his boot. He told his colonels to stop the frontal charges. Instead of hitting the ridge head-on, they would pivot. They would use one unit to hold the enemy's attention, while the rest of the force swung around the flank in a wide, arcing maneuver. They moved through the marshy lowlands that the Germans thought were impassable. The old doctrine was failing. This shift was a fundamental admission that their previous training had not prepared them for Normandy. By moving through the swamps and hitting the ridge from the side, the paratroopers bypassed the primary kill zones. They eventually took the high ground, but the cost revealed the staggering scale of the problem. The 325th Glider Infantry alone saw its strength drop from 1,300 men to under 1,000 in just 4 days. The manual had become useless. By early July, the American advance was no longer measured in miles. Progress was counted by the number of men lost for a single field of clover. This was the birth of the Hedgerow stare. It was a form of exhaustion that came from fighting a war, where you could rarely see the person killing you. The air was a constant racket of muffled mortar thumps, and the rhythmic strike of artillery against the earth. The answer to this graveyard of fields was still nowhere to be found. General Omar Bradley, the man they called the GI General, watched as his divisions ground themselves into non-existence. General J. Lawton Lightning Joe Collins, the 7th Corps commander, was growing increasingly restless. Collins believed in bulldozing through obstacles, yet even his aggressive nature was being thinned out by the geography. The expectations of the rear area planners, who thought this would be a 2-day operation, had vanished. The ridge became a tomb. To understand the cost of this transition, we have to look at a place the maps called Hill 122. By the first week of July, the drive south had stalled against this massive wooded ridge that dominated the center of the peninsula. The 79th and the 90th Divisions were thrown against it. On paper, they had the numbers, but in reality, they were walking into a landscape shaped by centuries of erosion and years of German engineering. The hill remained in German hands. The German defenders were not sitting on the crest of the hill waiting to be hit by artillery. They were using a reverse slope defense. When the heavy guns opened up, the shells screamed over the top and exploded on the forward face of the ridge. The German grenadiers sat safely on the backside, tucked into deep bunkers. The moment the barrage lifted and the infantry started their climb, the Germans simply moved back up to the crest with their machine guns. Between July 3rd and July 8th, these two divisions sustained over 4,000 casualties. Some companies were reduced to 20 men. In the 90th Division, the attrition was so severe that they cycled through 5 different commanders in a single week. The problem was not just the hill, but the way the offensive was being managed from the top. Every move had to be cleared through a rigid chain of command that was still trying to fight a war of tidy lines and synchronized schedules. If a battalion found a gap in the hedge, they often had to wait for permission to exploit it. By the time the word came back down, the gap was closed. This was the tactical paralysis that was bleeding the First Army white. The shift toward improvisation finally began to break the stalemate. A colonel of the 79th reached his breaking point during a push toward a machine gun nest that had pinned his entire battalion in a water-filled ditch. Radio signals often could not even penetrate the thick earth of the hedges. Instead of waiting for a new artillery plan or a tank that might never arrive, he threw his radio handset into the mud. He ordered his captains to sideslip the position. They stopped trying to hammer through the front and simply moved around the flank, navigating through a swampy thicket that was not on the tactical overlay. He chose movement over permission. To see the moment this became official policy, you have to look at General Weich, the commander of the 79th. He paced through a rain-soaked orchard, watching his regimental commanders struggle with the weight of their losses. He realized that the speed expected by his superiors was impossible as long as the men were tethered to a central plan. He called his commanders together and told them they no longer needed his permission to attack when they saw an opening. He was handing them autonomy. He was telling them that the man in the dirt knew more than the man at the map table. The map no longer mattered in a modern mechanized army. A general giving up control is almost unheard of. But Weech saw that the only way to beat the Hedges was to let the battle become 1,000 small independent wars. While the Americans were learning these hard lessons, the German command was facing a slow, bleeding exhaustion. Their front was not just being pushed, it was being hollowed out. They were losing officers faster than they could replace them. Their reserves were being committed in tiny piecemeal groups that were destroyed before they could even form a line. Field Marshal von Kluge was beginning to realize that he was not presiding over a defense anymore. He was presiding over a collapse. He described his tanks as corset stays, the only thing keeping a broken infantry force from folding inward. The German line was snapping. We often think of the breakout as a single explosion of movement, but it was actually a series of disjointed, exhausting actions. By the time the 79th Division finally secured the high ground on Mont Castre, they were a skeleton force. They had moved only a few miles in a week, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite. But they had broken the reverse slope trap. They had proved that individual initiative was the only thing keeping the advance moving. The pursuit was finally beginning. To understand the pressure building by the middle of July, you have to look at the casualty report sitting on General Omar Bradley's desk. In just 12 days of fighting, his forces had suffered over 15,000 casualties. The 8th Corps alone had lost 10,000 men to gain a few miles of mud and timber. This was not a breakthrough, it was a hollowing out of the American infantry. Bradley, usually a man of quiet composure, watched his divisions lose their offensive edge as companies were reduced to the size of platoons. He realized that the aggressive tactics favored by General J. Lawton Lightning Joe Collins were hitting a wall. The army was trading lives for Hedges. Now, consider the view from the other side of the line. While General Bradley worried about his momentum, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge watched his entire front turn into a ruin. He had arrived to replace the dismissed Rundstedt, stepping into a situation that was already beyond repair. He was an energetic professional, but he quickly realized he had been handed the job of a fireman in a building already engulfed in flames. He spent his days racing between headquarters, trying to find reserves that did not exist, and armor that had been reduced to a handful of functional tanks. The disparity in resources was staggering. To understand the reality of the German defense, you have to look at the ammunition counts. On a typical day in mid-July, the German batteries were able to fire roughly 4,500 shells across the entire front. In response, the Allied artillery rained down 80,000 rounds. This was not a tactical competition. It was a systematic pulverization. Kluge saw his veteran paratroopers ground into the dirt by a weight of metal they could not possibly match. The Allied air cover was so complete that German supplies could only move at night, hunted by flares and night fighters. On July 13, 1944, the facade of the German defense finally cracked, at the highest level. Kluge picked up a telephone in a dark, requisitioned chateau to speak with the High Command in Berlin. This was not a formal report, it was a desperate admission of reality. Visualize the field marshal, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver, shouting a single word to his superiors. Kladderadatsch. In German military slang, it means the awful mess, or the total collapse. He told Berlin that the front was no longer a line, but a series of isolated pockets held together by the grit of individual soldiers. He described his few remaining tanks as corset stays. They were the rigid internal frame, intended to keep a soft, collapsing body of infantry from folding inward. But the corset was breaking. He admitted that if a single major hole opened in the line, he had nothing left to patch it with. Every reserve had already been fed into the American meat grinder. Kluge was telling his superiors that the war in the West was already lost. While Kluge was sounding the alarm, Bradley was reaching a similar conclusion from a different perspective. He saw that the German defense was brittle. It was stubborn, but it lacked depth. Because Hitler had prohibited the construction of secondary defensive lines, there was nothing behind the front-line hedges but open road. Bradley realized he did not need to win 100 small battles for 100 different fields. He needed one massive, concentrated blow to shatter the corset stays once and for all. This is the moment the strategy shifted from the tactical to the industrial. Bradley began to pull his most exhausted units back to clear the way for a massive saturation bombing. He was moving away from the plodding techniques of the previous weeks. He planned to use the full weight of the Allied air forces to create a corridor of destruction. It was a high-stakes gamble. If the bombing failed to break the line, the First Army would be left ineffective in the middle of a swamp. The German records from those days show that the collapse was already happening. The German 7th Army headquarters operated in a state of detached, bureaucratic routine. While the men in the foxholes were losing the ability to fight back, one officer protested that they could not meet American material with courage alone. The German machine was fragmenting. The map showed shadow divisions that existed only on paper, facing an American force that was learning to trade ammunition for blood. The stalemate was the final, static gasp of an army with no fallback position. To understand how this mess felt on the ground, you have to look at a single bridge at a place called Hedgerow. The Americans had the steel, but they were choking on their own strength in the narrow gates leading towards St. Lo. By the second week of July, the plan was to shove an armored division through a bridgehead already packed tight with infantry. Visualize the physics of that moment. Over 6,000 men and 1,100 vehicles were trying to squeeze through a single muddy corridor. The bridge at Hedgerow became a 20-mile-long parking lot. This was the friction of war in its purest form. At night, under a drizzling rain, a German artillery shell struck a half-track right in the middle of the crossing. The vehicle sank into the structure, halting the entire column. Behind it, thousands of men sat in the mud, listening to the laboring engines and the distant thumping of mortars. To the commanders in the rear, it looked like a delay on a map. To the men in the column, it was a state of paralyzed vulnerability. They were bumper to bumper in narrow lanes, hemmed in by the same hedges that had been killing them for a month. To see what this friction looked like at the granular level, you have to look inside one of those stalled Sherman tanks. A loader the men called Lefty was jammed into the hot, oily dark of his turret, while the column sat exposed in a sunken lane. A 75mm shell had failed to seat properly in the breach, and the casing was stuck fast. In a narrow lane with German gunners zeroed in on the road, it was a death sentence. Lefty did not call for a mechanic. He took a heavy screwdriver and a mallet, and hammered the jammed brass casing out of the breach while the tank vibrated in the mud. He cleared the gun just as the column began to crawl forward again. While the men in the turrets were solving mechanical problems, the command structure was starting to fracture under the pressure of the gridlock. General Bradley and General J. Lawton Collins were demanding speed. They wanted the armor to burst through the infantry lines and reach the high ground at Hill 91, but the terrain refused to cooperate. The armored force was designed for the wide-open plains of North Africa, not the 3-yard-wide cattle paths of Normandy. The tanks were too big for the war they were being asked to fight. This tension focused entirely on General Bone, who commanded the lead armored elements. General Bone was a professional, but he was cautious. He looked at the narrow roads and the lack of reconnaissance and saw a trap. He refused to throw his tanks into the dark without knowing what was behind the next hedge. From the perspective of his superior, General Leland Hobbs of the 30th Infantry, this was not caution. To Hobbs, it was a failure of nerve. The two men represented the fundamental conflict of the campaign, the need for methodical safety versus the requirement for a breakthrough at any cost. The situation reached a breaking point on the afternoon of July 8, 1944. General Hobbs was so frustrated by the lack of progress that he issued a blunt ultimatum. He told Bone he had to reach the crest of Hill 91 by 5 o'clock that evening, or face the consequences. While this command drama was unfolding, the reality on the ground turned tragic. Because of the congestion and the lack of communication between the armor and the infantry, a tank destroyer crew mistook their own approaching tanks for a German counterattack. In 15 minutes of friendly fire, a single company lost 9 tanks. General Bone sat by his radio, listening to the awful clarity of a tank commander crying out in agony as his unit was decimated by his own side. By the time the sun began to set, the armored dash had failed. Only 6 tanks actually reached the crest of the hill, and they sat there alone in the fading light. They were even strafed by their own aircraft because no one in the rear knew they had made it. The next morning, General Bone was relieved of his command. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the image of Bone sitting motionless in the back of a mud-splattered jeep. He watched his replacement take over, his career over because he could not make the geography move faster than the mud allowed. This was the moment the American command realized that bulldozing was not just a tactic, but a necessity. They stopped worrying about the perfect synchronization of armor and infantry and started demanding results, regardless of the friction. The dash of armor was stopped not by the enemy, but by the weight of its own tail. The Americans had the power to break out, but they were still learning that in the hedgerows, the primary enemy was often the internal confusion of their own massive machine. No one asked for a second opinion after that. By the middle of July, the entire offensive had narrowed down to a single name on the map: St. Lo. To understand why this ruined market town mattered, you have to look at the roads. It was the only place where the narrow, mud-choked lanes of the peninsula converged into major highways heading south and east. Without it, the thousands of trucks and tanks were just sitting targets. The German defense here was anchored on a piece of high ground called Hill 122. From those heights, German observers could see every American movement for miles. They were not just fighting for a town, they were fighting for the right to sea. The cost of taking that ridge was so high that it nearly broke the 29th Division. By the time they reached the base of the slope, the rifle companies were down to 40% strength. This is the point where the distinction between the rear area and the front line simply vanished. In the heat of the struggle for the slopes, an infantry mess cook dropped his heavy soup ladle and grabbed a discarded M1 Garand. He did not wait for orders. He just stepped into a gap in the line and moved up the rise with the survivors. When historians talk about skeleton forces, this is what they mean. Cooks, clerks, and mechanics were fighting as foot soldiers because there was no one else left. Now, consider the decision that changed the momentum. Most leaders would have kept hammering at the front door of the city, engaging in a suicidal street-by-street fight through the debris. But General Gerhardt saw a different way. He was a man who did not care much for the sterile maps provided by his staff. General Gerhardt stood in the mud and pointed his cane toward what he called the northeast gate of the city. He realized the Allied forces had already destroyed the town with their own bombers. The streets were blocked by mounds of stone and timber 3 stories high. Instead of fighting through that graveyard, he ordered his men to pivot. He swung his main effort around the ridges, bypassing the worst of the ruins to seize the heights and the exit roads at the same time. While Gerhardt was pivoting, the German command was watching its front turn into a fragmented ruin. The German paratroopers were reduced to a third of their strength. Their veteran divisions were being ground into the dirt by a weight of metal they could not possibly match. By the time the American forces actually entered the town on July 18th, it was not a victory of maneuver, but a victory of exhaustion. The city was a smoking heap of stone. One of the most famous images from this moment is a flag-draped body placed on the rubble-strewn steps of a church. It served as a silent shrine for the 40,000 casualties the First Army had suffered just to reach this point. Taking St. Lo and the high ground around it gave the Allied forces the lateral communications they needed. They finally had the southern exit routes. The rigid internal frame of the German defense had been snapped. The static, bloody attrition of the hedges was over, and the mobile phase of the war was about to begin. They had turned a graveyard of meadows into a gateway, but they had paid for every yard in blood. Now, we return to the geysers of the Via River, where the pontoons are finally locking into place. The friction that had paralyzed the river crossing for days finally yielded to the persistence of the engineers. As the first heavy tanks of the armored division roll across the metal plates, the sound is no longer just the laboring of engines in the mud. It is the sound of a machine that has finally found its gear. But to understand why this moment was different from the failures of the previous week, you have to look at the back of those tanks. During the stalemate, the biggest killer was silence. Tankers were buttoned up inside their steel boxes, blind and deaf to the infantrymen screaming for help just 10 feet away. But as the column moved south from the river, the men were using a new solution. They had welded external field telephones to the rear of the tank hulls. Now, a sergeant in the dirt could pick up a handset and talk directly to the tank commander inside. They were no longer 2 separate forces fighting 2 separate wars in the same field. They were a single coordinated hammer. The bulldozing that the generals had demanded was finally happening because the men had found a way to bridge the gap between the armor and the infantry. This coordination was the final weight that snapped the German defense. The veteran German armored units that held the lines together were being bypassed and isolated. On Martinville Ridge, an isolated radioman huddled in a shell hole and watched as the German columns finally began to pull back. They were being forced out of their sunken roads and stone fortifications by an American force that had stopped trying to follow the pre-invasion manual. The answer to the central question, how did the Americans turn a graveyard of fields into a breakout, is found in that moment. The answer lives in the cumulative, stubborn adaptation of men who refuse to be stopped by a landscape. The camera pans across the smoking ruins of St. Lo. The Hedgerow hell is over. but the pursuit across France is just beginning. A single American infantryman sits on a pile of stones that used to be a bakery. He is cleaning the mud from his rifle with a rag, his face caked in dust. He looks toward the open, rolling hills of the south. It is the first time he has seen the horizon in 2 months. To see this transition at the very edge of the front, you have to look at the Martinville Ridge. There, an isolated radioman huddled in a shell hole, his uniform caked in the grey mud of the peninsula. He had been there for hours, tucked into a fold of earth so shallow that he could hear the boots of German patrols passing just yards away. He was the eyes of the division. In a whisper, he spoke into his handset, calling down artillery coordinates on the very roads the Germans were trying to use for their retreat. Think about the answer to the question we started with. How did the Americans turn a graveyard of fields into a breakout? The radioman watched through the haze as the German trucks and horse-drawn wagons were caught in the open, shattered by the shells he had summoned. The answer was not found in a single war-winning invention or a stroke of genius from a headquarters miles away. It lived in the cumulative, stubborn adaptation of men who refused to be stopped by a landscape. The breakout happened because the American army had finally learned how to fight in this specific corner of the world. It was the engineer who refused to drop his wrench while the river boiled around him. It was the colonel who threw away his radio to lead a flank attack on foot. It was the tanker who finally stopped trusting his periscope and started listening to the man on the ground. They did not outshoot the German paratroopers in a fair fight. They outadapted them. They turned the awful mess of the hedges into a laboratory for a new way to win. By the time the German defenders finally abandoned the ridge, the road to the south was no longer a series of traps. It was an exit. The pursuit across France was about to begin, but the cost remained visible in every yard of the crossroads city. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of the place, the men called the gateway. The Hedgerow hell was officially over. The camera pans across the smoking heaps of stone that used to be a market town, now a graveyard for both Allied and German ambitions. The claustrophobia of the last 2 months, the green walls, the sunken lanes, and the hollow stare of the infantry was finally lifting. A single infantryman sits on a pile of shattered stones that used to be a bakery. His face is a mask of dust and dried sweat, his eyes heavy with the exhaustion of someone who has forgotten what it feels like to be dry. He is cleaning the mud from the bolt of his rifle with a rag, a slow, rhythmic gesture of a man who knows the fighting is not over. But the environment has changed. For the first time in 2 months, he is not looking at a wall of dirt 10 yards away. He is looking toward the south, at the open, rolling hills of the French interior. He is looking at the horizon. No one asked for a second opinion. He just stood up, shouldered his rifle, and started walking toward the open country. If your father or grandfather served in an infantry division or an armored unit in the Norman Bocage, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. Please share the unit he served with, the fields he saw, and the memories he brought home. Those specific personal details are the true history of the war, and they deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join us for the next chapter as we follow the road toward Paris.